So Catherine, thank you so much for joining us today. I wonder if you could just start by introducing yourself for our audience and just tell me a little bit about you, your background. That would be amazing.
So I'm Catherine McLeod. I'm the Chief Executive of Dingley's Promise, and Dingley's Promise supports children with SEND in the early years. I have always worked with disability for my whole life, starting off when I was very young, and then I've worked overseas in international development and making sure disability is part of international development, and then finally back to the UK, and I've now settled in early years. So I've been in this role for 10 years, and yeah, I'm absolutely passionate about inclusion, giving children with SEND the best opportunities.
So your journey in the charity sector, which is where you sort of really first started to come through, it spans over 2 decades. I hope you don't mind me saying that.
I'm really young.
What first inspired you to focus on inclusion for children with SEND, and how has that mission changed over the years for you?
So it all started off at a friend's house when I was 8 years old, and she had a bunny rabbit, and there was a house over the road, and she said, "Ooh, if we take the bunny rabbit over the road, there's some children there, they can play with the rabbit and we can play in a massive ball pool." So not being funny, but when you're 8, a ball pool is heaven.
Sounds like a great trade.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went over there, and I was just really confused as to why there was a house full of young children. They were all children with SEND and high need children, and I just was very confused. Why are they here? Why aren't they with their families? What's going on? And that day I went home, obviously very young, and just said, I don't like that, it's not right. And that was literally where it came from. I don't have relatives with disabilities or anything like that. It's just, that's what hit me. And so as soon as I was able to, I started volunteering with children as a sort of peer support person to support children with SEND. And then eventually went overseas volunteering in a home for children with disabilities as well. And it just grew and grew, really. It's always been the most important thing to me.
I want to touch on the international work, if I may, because I'm fascinated by it. I'm sure our audience will be as well. So you've worked internationally and you've faced cultural barriers with promoting inclusion, I would probably say. I wonder if you can share an example of how you've navigated a particularly, say, challenging cultural difference.
Yeah.
And what you learned from that experience.
I think it's really difficult. It's a really difficult thing to do because as somebody who doesn't come from a community or a country, it's very easy to look inappropriate, sort of a white saviour type complex, something that I think when I was younger I didn't understand that. But certainly since I started working in Sri Lanka, I set up a charity called EXUT, which stands for Equality-Based Community Support and Training, and in Sinhala it means United. Yeah. So that charity, I think what was really striking was that there are lots of children in communities so we were in the southwest of Sri Lanka, lots of children who during the day they couldn't get access to education because they had special educational needs, and the parents didn't know what to do with them, so they would literally lock up the house, leave them in the house with water in one corner and then a bucket in the other corner, and come back at the end of the day because they didn't have anything to do. They didn't know what to do with them, and they didn't have services. And what was really interesting was that was based in a lot of beliefs also around karma, and if you have a disability, what did you do in your past life, or what did your family do in your past life? And it wasn't me saying that's not the way to think, but actually I obviously had a team. I was the only foreigner on that team. So while I started the charity, it was very much led and run by Sri Lankan people. And what was interesting was they would go in and meet with the families, meet with the communities, and start to talk about what was possible, and then start sharing things like little videos of, oh, look at this. So this child who you might have seen a child like this and assume they can't communicate. But look, when you have a communication aid, they're actually talking, but in their own way. And people very quickly said, wow, this is possible, and changed really quickly, changed their way of thinking. And so when we first went there, the temples in the area we were working in would not allow disabled children in.
Yeah.
And again, it was around karma, and it was so they just weren't going to temple. And temple in Sri Lanka is like the centre of social life as well.
Yeah, really important.
But they weren't allowed in. And so my team, we had a celebration for World Children's Day, and we had a procession down the streets, and my team worked with the temples and the monks in the temples, and they all came together. They had a procession down the middle of the town. They all had placards, basically, you know, I'm perfect, my mother loves me, you know, because they wanted to say we are perfect.
Yeah.
And the procession ended up in the temple, and all of them were led into the temple by the monks, and it was the first time that had happened. So, you know, it wasn't me, but you know, I facilitated that organisation to set up, and then it was, you know, Sri Lankan people who were driving that change, but using their culture to do that. It was. Yeah, makes me. I've gone a bit funny.
I'm getting shivers as well.
It was an amazing moment. Yeah.
Story. I to some extent, I think it quite accurately reflects, you know, attitudes to sending back in the UK now, in terms of people genuinely want to be able to provide support and care and education in the right way, what the science and the practices tell us nowadays, but perhaps are not yet with all the answers or the confidence to do so, which is, you know, again, why your work's so important and the work of others in that sense. So that brings me on to training.
Yes.
So training and support are, of course, they're key to building confidence, particularly in practitioners working with SEND children. What approaches have you found the most effective in increasing inclusivity in early year settings, and especially for those that may feel unprepared? Yeah,
so I think what people underestimate about training is that such a key part of it is what you said, is confidence.
Yeah.
And what we have found is, so our training is online and individuals can take it, but where it works best is where whole settings say, let's take it a chunk at a time, we'll all do it at the same time, we'll discuss it, how we're feeling, and then it gets embedded. So that's really, really critical. But what is really interesting is a lot of the people, when they finish the course, say, yes, I learned lots of new bits, but actually I realised I'm actually doing this quite well, and I now have the confidence that what I was doing is right. And that in itself is a really important move, because I think people often end up doing training and thinking, oh, I've been told that, but I'm not really sure that's right. But I think certainly currently we've got 17,000 practitioners across England on the training. And I think,
that's incredible.
Yes, it's growing very fast, but it's really that amazing chance to get a baseline and say, do you know what, we're all getting to this point where we really understand what does inclusive practice mean. We're confident in, I know what it means, and we can do it together. And I think that movement sort of feeling that's happening at the moment, that's what's so exciting, because it means everybody will have the baseline, and hopefully that will reduce the pressure on the settings who are known to be really good at SEND, and they then end up with lots and lots and lots of children who have SEND and are starting to get overwhelmed at the moment.
How do you think the sector can move forward a yes first mentality regarding SEND inclusion, and what would that shift look like in practice across different settings?
So I think what we have to recognise is there is loads of good practice already in settings, and there is lots of commitment to supporting every child. However, I think it would be fair to say at the moment the funding systems are not working properly. People are not able to access what they need when they need it. And it's certainly something that government are considering at the moment. And, you know, obviously we're talking about that a lot. The different funding streams need to be easy to access, because actually, yes, we all have a desire to make sure every child is included, but we are in situations where settings are saying, you know, we've got to our limit. We are self-funding this, which supports this child and that child. We're, you know, the whole sector is financially struggling. And when the support that you need to give and you want to give a child is going to cost you more and you can't access that funding, it then becomes a barrier. And a reason why settings sometimes say, do you know what, we're not we're not going to take that child. And so when they say we can't meet need, obviously that's something where we want to pick that apart and say, why can't we meet need? What does that actually mean to you? For some settings, it is related to, are they strong in their understanding? Are they strong in inclusive practice? Or do they think that the only way to support a child is to have a one-to-one adult? That was something that was more common previously. That is changing, and I think most people are now aware that actually one-to-one support for a child through research shows that doesn't lead to better life outcomes.
Yeah.
And so actually what people are trying to do is to have really inclusive strategies, bring children together and help children as a group. But you can't do it without the right resources. So I think it is funding. Obviously, we talked about training. Training is really important to have there as well. But I think with the last thing is also around paperwork. And a lot of settings say there's so much paperwork, especially after the EYFS changed and became less focused on tracking. The issue we have is to access the support for children with SEND, you need to do some kind of sort of tracking of development. But now that's not needed for other children. So some settings might go, well, actually, we're really struggling for money. We don't have the resource. We're not going to be paid to do that paperwork, and therefore we're not going to take the child. So it's not right. People know it's not right, but in a lot of situations, people feel they don't have a choice. So it's really difficult. Obviously, we would always be on the side of we would be accepting every child, but there are some really practical issues at the moment that settings are facing.
Yeah, indeed. And Catherine, I hope you won't mind me saying, I know that you yourself and your team have been working really hard to present solutions to a number of those practical issues. It'd be great if there's anything you can or you'd like to share, of course, about some of the work that you're doing at the moment.
So yes, at the moment, we've worked with the Department for Education to create assessment guidance. So that was launched a couple of weeks ago. Ideally, what will happen is that becomes one format that can be used to support practitioners and settings to identify needs early, because obviously we all know early identification leads to better life outcomes.
Yeah, of course.
So it helps identification, but it also helps to then structure the support that they're going to put in place for each child. So they're using a really strong graduated approach. So they're trying different strategies to support children as they go, because often we do need specialist support. We need specialist intervention at times. But before that specialist intervention comes in, we need to be really confident we've done everything we could have first. Because for many children, that will be enough and that will support them effectively. So that's one really important item. We are at the moment looking at working with local authorities to help them to understand how that assessment guidance can help them as well. Because if we end up with everybody using that, then when a child moves local authority area or when a staff member moves to a new setting, they'll already have the confidence in that process if it's the same thing.
As well,
Exactly. So that's really exciting. We're also at the moment working on an inclusion reflection tool, which we're doing again for Childcare Works under the Department for Education, which will help settings to really reflect deeply on how inclusive they are. There's a big difference between whether you're good at SEND and good at, do we know how to apply for an EHCP, what the processes are, what the paperwork is. But actually being really good at inclusive practice is quite a different thing. So we want to really focus on that. And we're also going to do some guidance also for Childcare Works around how to create really good inclusive curriculum and really looking at how that curriculum can be flexible and adaptable to lots of different children so they can all learn together around overall goals, but it's tailored to each individual child.
I'd see the work your team, yourself and your team are doing is exceptional, and I'm genuinely looking forward to how that develops on. My last question for you, it's a bit of a reflective one. I'd like to finish on a reflective question. So looking back at your career, what moment stands out as the biggest breakthrough in your work with SEND children, and what are your hopes for the future of SEND education?
Okay. So, to be honest, at the moment, I think in our settings, the moments when you see a child who has come to us and their parents have been told they're never going to go to the mainstream, they're always going to need special education, they'll probably never be independent. They're told those things when children are 2 years old.
Yeah.
And then they come to us, and I'm thinking of one in particular who after a year and a half transitioned back to a mainstream nursery and then went into mainstream school and is still there. And it's one of those things where you look at that and you think, had we not been there, when we first met him, he was in a setting not being supported effectively at all. And his parents probably would have just said, right, he needs special education, and that's what would have happened to him. Special education is great for some children, but it's not for every child. And it's just like giving every child the opportunity to be able to thrive in mainstream is just so exciting. So that is, I suppose, the really close moment when you sort of think, wow, okay, that's a massive life change for that whole family. And then I think, to be honest, even recently, the last week, the difference between this year's sort of the Labour Party conference, all the discussions that are happening, the difference between now and just last year is so overwhelming that people are talking about early years. What are the key issues? Let's talk about children with SEND. Let's talk about how we're being inclusive. It's on everybody's lips. And even last year, it was always me in the room putting my hand up going, excuse me, but what do we think about children with SEND and how are we going to support them better? And it is on everybody's agenda now. So I just feel this massive hope. And I probably shouldn't hope, but I think actually stop working if you don't have hope anymore, give up. So I still have hope, because I do think that at the moment we have the best chance we've ever had to make an actual real difference. And I think they're listening, and I am hopeful that things are going to improve.
Yeah, I am too. I'm near confident, I would say, particularly with respectable people like yourself leading and driving those messages and the agenda, and the sector on the whole driving that agenda. It's, as you say, it's been great to see the progression of the movement, especially in the last 12 to 18 months.
Yes.
And I think it's clear that it's important to everybody, not just some people. It's important to everybody.
Yeah.
And what I love in especially is with experts like yourself, outspoken and forthright with the agenda. It is giving people confidence to join that movement and speak out themselves, and actually not be afraid to say, look, I'm not where I feel I need to be able to be inclusive enough, or to be able to offer more SEND spaces and the like. So
I just think that it's really important to recognise we have really good practice in many settings, and we do need to build on that. But I do think that when you consider families and what families are facing in the early years, the numbers accessing early years are lower than they've been before. And local authorities have less provision than they've ever had before for children with SEND in the early years. So I just think that whatever we do, we have to recognise that the child is absolutely the focus of all the work that all of us are doing. However, those families need to feel supported in these earliest years. It's a tough time when you first realise that life is going a little bit differently to what you thought it was. And for our families to have confidence that the system is going to be able to support their children, we all have to be better. And we have to make sure there's more spaces for them. So, I suppose it's just really remembering that it is transformative, not just for the child, but for that entire family and for their future. So we have to keep that centred as well.